Hi, this is Joe. Thanks for coming back for another video. I've had some followers ask me how to change the brake rotors on the Jetson Bolt Pro. So what we have here is my Jetson Bolt Pro. I have it turned upside down. Take your mirrors off and then flip the bike upside down. Here we're looking at the front wheel, and I'm going to show you how to inspect your rotors and the reasons why you may want to change your rotors. When you ride, over time of applying the brakes, the brake rotors get hot and then cool off, and then that process is repeated. On the Jetson Bolt, the quality of the braking system is a little on the cheap side. So over time, this rotor can warp a little bit. Another possible problem is if you let your brake pads wear out and you don't change them, and you get a metal-to-metal contact between the metal backing on the brake pads and the rotor, you'll put score marks, and you could damage the rotors. So the best way to check is to get over and look down at your brake calipers here, and then just slowly rotate the wheel, watching down where the rotor comes in between the two brake pads. And you want to rotate that, and you want to look for any wobble in the rotor. You also want to look at the surface of the rotor, and you want to put your fingers on it and rub it. If there's any scoring or damage to the rotor, you want to replace the rotor. While you have your bike upside down, you also want to look down in the calipers, and you want to check how much brake pad material you have on the brake pads, and if it's low, you want to replace your brake pads. So let's just say my rotors are looking really good. They're nice and straight, but I'm going to still show you how to change your rotors and put on new rotors. So in case you run across a situation where you do need to change your rotors, you can do it easily. We'll start out in this video and take care of the front wheel, and in another video we'll show you how to change the rotor on the rear wheel. So let's go get some tools and let's get started. First off, we want to remove the brake caliper from the front wheel. What I have here is a 3/8 inch socket wrench and a 5mm hex head socket. And there's two bolts right here, and you may not be able to use a hex Allen wrench because these may be way too tight. So what you're going to have to do is loosen these bolts. If they're really tight, you may have to put a pipe on the end of your socket wrench to get some leverage, because they can be really tight. So what you want to do is you want to loosen and remove the bolts on the calipers. Then you can slide the caliper off the rotor, and then you can just let that dangle a bit. If you want, you can tape it to your fender, but I'm just going to let it dangle a little bit. Now what we can do is we can remove the axle nuts on each side of the wheel. What you want to do is you can either use a socket. I'm going to use a crescent wrench. A lot of you may not have sockets, so these nuts can also be very tight, so you may have to put a pipe on your crescent wrench or your socket wrench to loosen these nuts. And you want to loosen both sides. And you want to unscrew the nuts from the axle. You don't have to remove them, but what you want to do is be able to lift the wheel off the front forks. So what we're going to do now is, and I'm going to show you now how to remove the rotor and replace the rotor. Now we have the wheel on the floor. This is the rotor. Notice there's an arrow pointing this way. There's also a number written on the other side of the rotor. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bolts. The number says 160. That means that this rotor is 160 millimeters across. So make sure when you replace your rotor, you get a 6-hole pattern rotor that's 160 millimeters across in width. So what we need to remove the rotor is a 3/8 inch ratchet and a 4 millimeter hex socket. And what we're going to do is we're going to loosen the bolts, and they may be snug, so you may have to use your pipe. Make sure you seat the hex head properly in the bolt, or you could run the risk of stripping out the head on that bolt, and you don't want to do that. So make sure you're properly seated. And then when you have them all loose, you can take off the hex socket and you can turn them by hand to remove the bolts. Once you get the bolts loose, you can remove them. And make sure you don't lose your bolts. Then you can remove the rotor. Now we can get the new rotor. Now we have the new rotor. We're going to put the rotor on. Make sure we follow the arrow position and the number. We want to line up the holes. Now before we put the bolts in, you want to go over and you want to pick out some Threadlocker, and you can either purchase this at a local auto parts store, or you can pick up some Threadlocker at Harbor Freight Tools. It's much cheaper at Harbor Freight Tools. A word of caution: you want to make sure you pick up the blue Threadlocker. You don't want to pick up the red Threadlocker. The red Threadlocker is more of a permanent Threadlocker, and it needs 500 degrees of heat to loosen that. So you don't want to use the red. You want to use the blue Threadlocker. So what you want to do is you want to take your bolt, and if you look carefully, you'll see some blue on the threads. And that means that these bolts had Threadlocker on them before. You want to take and just put a drop of Threadlocker on the bolt, and then you want to screw the bolt into the hole. The purpose of the Threadlocker is to keep the bolts from loosening due to vibration. You don't want to lose any of the bolts on your rotor. So what we want to do is, once we get the Threadlocker on the bolt, we want to screw the bolt in, and we just want to lightly screw the bolts in until we get all of the bolts in. And again, on each bolt you want to put just a drop of Threadlocker till the threads are covered in blue, and then we can gently screw the bolts in, and then we can just keep on working our way around on all of the bolts. Then we want to tighten all of the bolts, and you want to go in a crisscross pattern. You want to do one side and then the opposite side. Pick another bolt and go cross. And then you want to make sure and go all the way around and make sure all the bolts are tight. And again, you want to make sure that hex head socket is firmly inserted into the bolt. If you don't get it firmly inserted into the bolt, you could strip the bolt, and you don't want to do that. Once all the bolts are tight, we can now remount the wheel onto the front forks. Before you mount the wheel to the forks, you want to take a look. There's a little metal clip here, and there's two washers. You want to make sure the washers are all the way facing the bolt. You want to insert the fork pieces behind the washer, and then you want to insert the little tab. You bring this down, you pull your washers back, you insert the fork, and then you take the little tab, and if you notice here, there's a little hole, and you want to insert that tab into the hole on each side of the wheel. And then you want to tighten both bolts evenly. You want to give, before you tighten down the wheel, you want to spin the tire, and you want to look and make sure the wheel is centered equally between the forks. You can then do some minor adjustments with the bolts to make sure that wheel is aligned within the center of the forks. Now what you can do is you can get your wrench and you can tighten the axle bolts. At this point, we want to tighten the axle bolts, and you want to tighten a little at a time on one side and then a little on the other side. That way you'll tighten them and keep the spacing the same. Once the bolts are tight, you want to spin the wheel. Make sure the wheel is centered and is turning freely. And you want to make sure you really tighten those bolts snugly, because you don't want your front wheel falling off when you're riding. At this point, we can remount the brake caliper to the two holes on the front fork. Again, now it's also a good time to check your brake pads and make sure you have enough brake material on the brake pads. We can now put the caliper back on, and again, get yourself some Threadlocker, and you want to put a drop or two on each of the bolts, and then you want to mount the caliper to the forks with the bolts. Then again, we'll put some Threadlocker on the second bolt. Just a drop will do. Then we can get our 5mm hex socket. Now we can take, after we've finger tightened the bolts, we can now take our socket and our hex head, and we want to snug the bolts up first. Then we want to spin. Notice the wheel is a little snug, so what we can do is we can adjust the tension on the calipers again, and I'll show you how to do that. On the back side of the caliper, notice there's a little hex screw. What we want to do is take our 5mm hex socket. You might be able to turn this by hand. If not, just use your socket. And you want to loosen that bolt until your wheel spins freely. You don't want to loosen it too much, because then it's going to require more squeeze on your brake handles. Loosen it just enough to where you get some nice play in your wheel. Now we can come back around to the other side, and we can fully tighten the caliper bolts. And then finally we want to check the wheel to make sure we're spinning freely. If you hear there's just a slight drag on the calipers, and that's okay. As long as the play is free. If it's dragging a little bit, then you can come back and loosen that hex bolt on the rear side of the calipers. Hope you enjoyed this video. In the next video, I'll be showing you how to replace the rotor on the rear wheel on the Jetson Bolt Pro.